Hey there, it's Rod Yates here. Thanks for joining me on another episode of Humans of Music, a Jaxsta podcast. Each episode I talk to a music creator or industry professional about their life and career, the ups and downs of their journey and the lessons they've learned. And my special guest today is singer-songwriter Matthew E. White. So Matthew's just released his third solo record called K-Bay. And if you like the sound of an album that is wildly diverse and takes in everything from futuristic pop to 70s funk to sweeping orchestration to jazz and all points in between, then this is a record for you. It has absolutely no regard for current trends, but then that's kind of how Matthew has run his career from day one. Starting out in the experimental music scene in Richmond, Virginia, Matthew gradually built a self-contained musical community. He promoted shows and played with his jazz band Fight the Big Bull, and then had an idea for creating this self-sustaining music company where he would record artists, provide them with a house band, and release their music. That idea evolved into Spacebomb, which Matthew describes as a vertically integrated ecosystem that offers record label, production, publishing, and management services. To prove that the concept would work, he wrote, recorded, and released an album in 2012 called Beginner, expecting it to sell a few hundred copies. Not because he didn't think it was good, but just because he didn't expect many people to be interested. Turns out, a lot of people were interested, and the record became a critical smash and took Matthew around the world on an 18-month tour, putting Spacebomb on the map in the process. Since then, Spacebomb has released albums by artists like Natalie Prass, Bedouin, and Nadia Reid, and has become one of the most well-regarded independent music companies in the world. It's an incredible story, not least because going into Spacebomb, Matthew had absolutely no experience or interest in operating as part of the music industry. We talk about that whole ride in this interview, as well as Matthew's upbringing in the Philippines and Japan, his path into music, and much, much more. But we started by talking about Matthew's wild new album, K-Bay. It sounds to me like a record that the shackles were off. And I'm not suggesting that the shackles were on your first two records, but this just feels like it's a kaleidoscope of color with different moods and instrumentation and moving through different genres. It's an incredible listen. It exists in its own universe. What was your mindset going into the record?
I mean, I knew I wanted it to be pretty large in scope, just in terms of, I think some records you want to record them quickly, and some records you want to move fast and you want to get them done or kind of move quickly through the songs or something. But with this record, I knew that I wanted to spend a lot of time with all the material and with the musicians, and it feels like, I don't know if it's necessarily the end of the road, but it felt like sort of a completion or like a full development of a lot of the things that I've been working on since Beginner, in terms of how I work with arrangements or how I work with the band and what those personal relationships are and musical relationships. And I knew that I just wanted to spend a lot of time with those guys and just kind of bear down on the material and leave a lot of space for myself. I mean, I think that for me, the primary idea was just to put the onus on me to make as many decisions as possible, production decisions and songwriting decisions and singing decisions and arrangement decisions and engineering decisions, and just have a system of recording a record, or, when you're kind of planning all that, like making it so that, the ball would kind of be in my court at the end of the day, every day, to kind of like make all the decisions. And I just feel like it was just a development of a lot that I've been working on. And I felt very much in control of the sessions and of like the ideas and what I wanted to accomplish. And, it was definitely stretching out in that way, like giving myself space to use all the skill sets that I have.
Why did you want that? Because that feels like a lot of pressure to put on yourself, for you to have the final say on all those different aspects of the creating of the record. Why? Where do you think that comes from, that desire to take on that responsibility?
Well, I think it comes from hearing some aspects of earlier records that I've done and knowing that I haven't left it all on the court, to use a sports analogy. But like, I can just hear that, especially in Fresh Blood. I can hear where I maybe deferred to other people that were in the room for a variety of reasons, or not all of them bad. Just, I can just hear it. I know that I had more to give as a producer and as a songwriter and as a singer and as an arranger and as an engineer. I knew that there was more in the tank and I hadn't really like exhausted. I hadn't heard what it sounded like if I kind of got to the bottom.
Yeah.
And I just know that I just knew that I wanted to hear that. I wanted to hear what it sounded like when, you know, I had pretty much made things the way that I wanted them to. And that doesn't mean, obviously, you know, like so much of this record is about working with guys that I've worked with for a long time now. But even in those relationships, it's like I listen back and I'm like, man, I feel like I can get more out of that relationship in terms of like, you know, where we're getting to musically. And I think that's mainly it, is just not being content with what I've heard recorded so far, because I know that there's more there. You want to kind of squeeze everything out of it that you can. And I knew that I hadn't done that.
Judy is a recurring character throughout 3 of the songs. Who does Judy represent, or what does Judy represent?
Judy's my wife, Mary.
Okay. So she's a big influence on these songs.
Well, yeah, I guess that whole concept came from listening to John Lennon sing about Yoko in his songs, especially in his like late period songs, where he just refers to her almost like, sometimes it's, you know, it's like part of the song, and sometimes he just will like say her name. And I thought that there's something really very intimate about that, actually, that there's somebody in his life that he feels comfortably just kind of like tossing into a song. Even it's not like as intentional as like writing a whole song. And I just love how that feels like in the scope of a lot of that late period work. And I also think that it is reflective, actually, of, I don't know, kind of more of a long-term committed relationship, as opposed to other types of relationships that sometimes get written about more often. So it's not really something that I thought about too much, other than I just kind of had that name. I thought that was a good name, like syllabically. I just had it in my head as like something to use sometime. And then I just kind of started putting it in places where I was, you know, thinking about my wife, or just, you know, kind of like named it as something that would represent my wife. And then I just kind of use it, you know, so it was pretty casual. And but at the same time, like I wanted it to be that way. It wasn't like I sat down to write a record about my wife, but I do think that obviously, I think in the record there is that, but almost more so in other songs that don't mention her, like Take Your Time and Find Your Orange to Squeeze is very much about like waiting for the right person or whatever. And, you know, I don't mention her in that song at all. So, you know, it's funny. I'm hardly ever writing about anything super focused. I mean, there are a couple of songs in the record, but especially when it's about love songs, a lot of times it's just a memory vault of experiences and you know, how things come across. But the constant use of her name, you know, it's just sort of a metaphor for a long-term committed relationship.
Okay. There is one of the songs on the record where you do seem to have a very clear focus, and that song is Only in America When the Curtains of the Night Are Peeled Back, sort of a song in 2 parts. And it starts with that beautiful sort of widescreen instrumentation, which I think is encapsulating that idea of the American dream, but offset by quite dark lyrics about race relations in America. And then it moves into the second part of the song, and you actually name check a number of African Americans who have either died at the hands of police, or I think in the case of Emmett Till, who was lynched when he was 14 in 1955. So when you're name checking these people, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Emmett Till, Corey Jones, there must be a weight. There's a weight to that, because you want to pay respect to these people in the context of the song, I imagine. Did you feel a weight while writing that song?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, I worked on that song harder than any song on the record, for sure. Just because it's significantly larger weight than any other song on the record by a long, long way, you know? So, yeah, I mean, I just tried to pay respect to the folks that I was singing about, and to the pain that I was singing about, by just digging in to the craft of it and trying to do the best I could to express clearly and effectively, with both directness and nuance, some of that circumstance.
Was there a particular moment that it struck you that that was a song you needed to write?
Yeah, there were a bunch of songs that I wrote kind of like that were sort of along the lines of that kind of material. And it sort of started after Ferguson. I mean, I almost wrote that. That song's older, but that was the oldest song on the record. And I probably started writing it a long time ago, because when Childish Gambino came out with This Is America, and I already had that chorus, that song was already like 2 years old when Childish Gambino, and This Is America came out in like 2017 or something. So, I mean, I worked on that song for a long time. And I would say, I don't know if I just said this out loud, but I would say, like, when Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson and there were the riots in Ferguson, like, that was, I was pretty engaged with that. That was an eye opener, or just an event that caught me a little bit, you know?
Okay. There's another song, Genuine Hesitation. It's got a line in there: "I've been getting old since I was very young." Have you always felt like an old soul?
That's an interesting lyric to pull out. I mean, maybe, I don't know. I think there's, you know, with lyrics like that, when someone like yourself pulls them out of context, there's like a real short story to that. I mean, literally, my friend walked into the room and said that, we stumbled upon that somehow. We were joking around, and I was like, "Oh, that'd make a good lyric," and I wrote it down.
Right.
But at the same time, I think there is a part of that lyric that I relate to. But, you know, I think there's a little bit of me that feels like a little bit of a constant outsider, a little bit, and, you know, grew up overseas and then kind of moved back to the States and went overseas again. And, you know, lots of like international moving, you know. And so where is home? And like those kind of questions are, I think, relevant to like my psyche if we're really going into it. And so, yeah, I think there's portions of that spirit that I definitely relate to, but at the same time, it's just a lyric, you know. Sure. It's kind of there's a nice ring to it.
Sure.
The contradiction is nice.
Well, I did want to ask you about your upbringing. You mentioned that you were raised overseas, I think, because your parents were missionaries. So I think from between the ages of 3 and 8, you spent 3 or 4 years in Manila in the Philippines and then a year in Japan. Do you have any memories of those times?
Oh, yeah. I remember all of it, pretty much.
What springs to mind when you think of that time overseas?
Well, I mean, in the Philippines, there's a lot of playing outside. It's really, really hot.
Yeah.
A lot of traveling. My dad's like an incessant traveler. So like just traveling up and down the islands, like different beaches or like sort of like wild inner island villages and communities, you know, like places that aren't really, there's just not a lot of people that are in there. And I just have some like wild pictures of me in like a cave with like 1,000 skulls in it and just shit like, just like wild shit, you know, like, I don't know, you know, just like, I don't know. It's hard. There's 1,000 memories of just kicking around the Philippines, like going to cockfights when I was little, like just really what seemed normal or fun or, you know, a lot of beach stuff, you know. I mean, this definitely was like a part of the scene, was just scuba diving and being around the ocean.
Okay.
A lot of boats. And then Japan was wild because I was there a lot later. So I like went to the Philippines and I came back to the States for a bit, and then I went to Japan, and I was there like, you know, there's just a lot of personal freedom for youth in Japan, a lot more in the States, you know, because you have to have a car and stuff here. And just there, it's like you can just go anywhere, all over Tokyo, just on the train. And I mean, that was like heaven. I was 11 years old and I was just like taking a train all over Tokyo, you know, the whole time I was there, just different places, or going to Tower Records downtown, this stuff, you know, just different than here. And that was really fun. That was a really fun time.
The record stores in Tokyo are just phenomenal. In Japan in general.
Unbelievable.
Were you a music fan at that point? Were you actually going? You mentioned Tower Records.
I was into music growing up, like a lot. I loved music, but I started playing instruments in Japan, actually, because my dad was a principal, both Manila and Japan. My dad was a principal in the schools there. He had like a key to the band room. So I would just go in and like play drums and stuff. And one of my best friends, like mom was the middle school principal. So like we would just go in and like play. He has a guitar, I play drums. And that's when I started playing. And like that was like the first group of kids that liked it was like grunge and stuff. Like when that first started happening, I was a few years old at that point, and it was just like, it was the first time I was like engaging with like modern music at all. Cause I grew up listening to basically like Chuck Berry and the Beach Boys. So, I mean, yeah, I remember I got Pearl Jam 10. That was like the first CD I ever got.
Right.
But they had like Walkmans over there, and that was brand new. They didn't have Walkmans in the States at that time. And so it was like I got a Walkman and I could go to Tower Records and get a CD. They actually had like mini disc records. I remember that. I wanted a mini disc player so bad, which I didn't get. But they had like a whole section in Tower Records of just like mini disc records. It's just so weird. But yeah, I mean, I really got into music. So it was like, there's a lot nerdier record stores that would be fun to go to now if I went to Tokyo, but that I didn't know anything about. But I went to Tower Records probably. It was like every weekend I would take the train, because there was a music store underneath it or above it that it was like, they would like let kids like play, and you could put on headphones and like play the electronic drums, which I thought was like the coolest thing in the world. So yeah, and then that whole strip was like drum shops and like guitar shops, and like it was just a scene down there. Japan in particular was like really, I just happened to be really getting into music at that same time.
And was there anyone influencing you in that regard, or were you just discovering it all by yourself?
It was just like kids. There were like these other friends of mine that were just kind of into it, like older brother. It's a classic, like older brothers. And it was just like a community of American kids that were just floating around over there.
So how did you reintegrate or integrate into American society when you moved back? What age did you move back to Virginia Beach, and what did you make of it all?
I moved back in 3rd grade, and then I was here for 4 years, and then I moved back to Japan and then moved back again. So basically in the middle of elementary school, and then again in the middle school, I guess. So I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty like affable, so it was never like really like a big deal. Like in terms of like, I never felt it. I never felt stressed about it, particularly like in terms of meeting people or making friends, or that wasn't hard. So it wasn't difficult in that sense to integrate. But I don't know. It's hard for me to unpack that, because it wasn't like a conflict.
Right.
So I don't really have like a conflict that I look back on and sort of think about, that made me this way or that made me that way, because this conflict directed me one way or another. But I do think there's just this giant void in my life of culture that I don't know about or don't have experience with, like in terms of like movies and music of a certain period. And then I also think what comes with that is like, it can come across as really uncaring sometimes, but I don't really mean it that way. It's like, because I didn't grow up alongside like culture that was affecting my life. Like there weren't like records that were coming out that I was like, oh, I go to the store and get the new record or go see the new movie. That was never part of my life. I have no muscle memory of like caring about new shit. And again, it sounds really dismissive and like almost like too cool for school, but that's not really how I mean it. It's just, there's just so much stuff, like blank spots in my past that I didn't experience as a youth. And so I think that makes me not really like, there aren't things that new come out that I find interesting or find exciting, but if someone's like, oh, you should check out blah, 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 or if I hear a name a lot, I'm not drawn magnetically to know what's happening in pop culture at all.
Sure.
And it would be shocking. It would be completely shocking if you just went through names that are like huge that I've never heard, or I mean, maybe not to you, but to some people, it's just funny, what I don't know. But in some ways I'm kind of guarded about that, because it's like, that's what makes me. Yeah. And I think it's unique. It's like a lucky break that I got to never see Top Gun or Terminator or Home Alone. Like it's cool that I never saw that shit, or Goonies or whatever. Sure. It's like, and I don't know anything about anything from that time. And I think that helps in a way. It helps you just kind of separate nostalgia from craft a little bit, maybe. I don't know. I don't really know, but
that's an interesting take. And I guess particularly in terms of your own creativity and how you approach your own music or the production work you do, I think that I think that can't help but play a part in that.
Yeah, I know. I agree. It's hard to articulate what it might be, but I definitely agree that it most likely plays a part. certain sort of aesthetic decision making.
Yeah. One of the key, I guess, developments in your teens seems to have been you did some work experience at Master Sound Studios. I believe that through a family friend, through your church group or your parents' church group, Rob Walsh was who owned that studio, and I believe that Missy Elliott and Timbaland were working there at the time, and you asked if you could do work experience. What did you see there? What did you learn?
Well, I didn't really see. I mean, I don't see any of those guys around. You know, Rob didn't keep his interns around like when Pharrell was going to be there. But I remember I was just because Rob's still around. You know, he like sold that studio to Pharrell, and then he owns another studio in town. And I have like friends who will get, you know, kind of end up there every once in a while. And someone was just asking about him the other day. And there's two funny stories that I always think of. It's like one, I remember he explained to me, I asked him, I don't know how I thought of it, but I asked him what a producer was. Maybe because he was talking about Pharrell or something. And you know, when you're growing up, and there's a lot of jobs like this in the music industry that like, you just don't know, like how are you, especially before the internet, like how are you going to find out what a producer is? What does he actually do? What does that mean? Because now it's hard for me to describe that to people now because it means 20 different things to 20 different people. And it is a really flexible job. And I remember he sent me down and explained to me like all the things a producer did and kind of like what they could do and what they were responsible for and how they interface with the artists. And that was a pretty helpful conversation. I mean, as somebody who, you know, Rob, who saw that firsthand with world-class producers, like big producers at the time, you know, like Justin Timberlake recorded his first record there. And, you know, he was like really doing it, you know, like for real. So that was one conversation I remember is just a long sit down about what a producer does. Kind of walk me through the studio, sort of distinguish a producer from an engineer, which is sort of murky waters. But, you know, him and Pharrell had that relationship where he was an engineer and Pharrell was mainly the producer. And, you know, kind of like just told me you basically have to know everything about everything a little bit. But you don't have to be good at everything. You just kind of have to know everything a little bit. And to be honest, that's kind of like what I do. I'm not great at, there's a ton of stuff I'm not great at, but I just know a little bit about enough to kind of connect the dots in an interesting way sometimes. And then I remember a really embarrassing story about when I was like painting something outside and I'd made these 4-track demos on my 4-track at home.
Yeah.
But I had done it on the back. I'd done it on this tape. And I just done it on the front side, and on the back side was, I think it was Derek Trucks. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but Derek Trucks' first record. And, you know, he's like, whatever, like shredding. Sure. But that was when Derek Trucks was kind of new. He was like 16 years old or whatever when that record came out. But I gave him the demo. I was like, hey, Rob, like I made these songs, like check them out. And I remember him like bolting out of the studio. And he was like, oh my God, Matt, are you playing guitar on this music? And I was like, yeah, I am, Rob. That's cool. Like, thanks. I'm glad you like it. You know, I was like so full of myself, you know, so I was like, yeah, you know, it's great. Thank you. And he's like, you gotta come in here. We got to listen to this together. I cannot believe you're playing guitar on this. And we go inside and I'm obviously expecting him to like play these 4-track songs that I was very proud of. And he just presses play and it's the backside of the tape and it's Derek Trucks just like shredding. And I was just like, it was the worst feeling. And I was just like, Rob, like, that's not me, man. And then the worst part about it, because I think I had told him I had played all the instruments, because I had played all the instruments on the other side. And so he was like, so outside he had been like, you're playing bass and drums and guitar. And I was like, yeah. But like on Derek Trucks, it's like OTL Burbage and like whatever, like these like jam band freaks. And anyway, but then the worst part, he was like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like I listened to the wrong side. And then he just like flips the tape over and presses play. And it's just some like garbage, you know, like 15-year-old love songs. That was really one of the most embarrassing moments of my life, actually.
Not fair to be compared to Derek Trucks.
Oh yeah, well yeah, but especially by like this guy who like had an entree to like the biggest artist on the planet. And he was like stoked. So it was like for an instant, you're like, I made it. This is it. Like he'd give this to Pharrell or Missy or like whatever, like Busta Rhymes was in there all the time. And like, I was like, this is it. For like 2 seconds, I was like, I made it. I'm done. This is great. And then
glorious
it all
2
came
seconds.
like crashing down. Yeah, just horrible.
So was music it for you at this point, even in your teens? Were you like, yeah, it's either going to be production, it's going to be making it?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I mean, when I started playing guitar, like I said, in Japan when I was 11, and I mean, there was a time in my life where it was like I either wanted to be a professional basketball player, a professional surfer, or professional musician, and that was it. I remember when I was like in 7th grade, I was like, okay, what is it going to be? You know, I grew up at the beach and like surfed a ton and played basketball pretty seriously. And like, those were like the 3 things when I was growing up. And I honestly, I mean, I was much better. I think I made the right choice, but like, that was like the thing for me was like, what am I going to do? And I met a guy like when I was probably close to that age, 12, 13. And he was so confident about being a professional musician because actually all 3 of those occupations, it's like, where do you start? Like how do you get from A to Z? Mm. And I think I had a hard time seeing that in all of them. And then I met a guy who was like, I'm going to be a rock star, basically, is how he put it, which is sort of cheesy now to think of it. But he was so confident about it. He was probably, I mean, I was 12, so he was probably like 20, but he was just like, yeah, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a professional musician. I'm going to move to LA. I'm going to do it. And that was actually weirdly like really influential for me. I was just like, oh, he just said it. He just kind of spoke it into existence. And I actually don't know what happened to that guy, but there at a certain point, but when I was like an early teenager, I just started saying it to people. Like people would be like, what are you going to be? And I'm like, I'm going to be a musician.
Right.
And I just said it. And I just I believed it too. I wasn't like, I just was like, okay, this is what I'm going to be. You can just decide. And then I went to school for it. And that was really ignorant, but a good decision, but very innocent in the sense that I thought that I could just like go to school, you know, like you go to school to be a teacher or something. I thought that I could just go to school, get educated in it, and then be that job. And it didn't quite work like that, but it kind of did work like that for me. But it doesn't. But I didn't mean for it to. But it did kind of lead to where I am now for sure. So, you know. Anyway,
what did you learn there that helped you get to where you are now?
Oh, just the skill set. I mean, just the craftsmanship of it, like just the nuts and bolts, how music works, like just how it works, how the chords work, how the notes work together, how does form work, what's the history of, especially when you talk about jazz arranging, like, you know, the history of jazz arranging is basically like a proto history of production. I mean, all the kind of archetypical ways that we frame vocalists for pop music was invented by jazz arrangers in the 20s and 30s. And if you look at like kind of how we do that, like if you take Quincy Jones and you were to transcribe Thriller, like the stuff that he's using, the kind of like tricks that he's using aren't really that much different than his life as a jazz arranger for Count Basie. I mean, it's the same shit. It's like same kind of modulation, same kind of like entrances, same kind of like note choices, chord choices, like interludes, like all that stuff is really similar. I think that was really beneficial for me to like see a tie between, you know, like Kendrick Lamar and Louis Armstrong. And I mean, there's a lot of things that tie that music together. It's not, but I mean, you could tie, I mean, those maybe are more closely related, but someone like Adele and Louis Armstrong, or someone that seems so juxtaposed, or I don't know, maybe they don't to some people, but just really modern pop music and really nostalgic to most people, sort of early jazz is they're really, really related, not just culturally, but in the bones of how you put the arrangement together. And I think that was a huge, huge leap for me to kind of, you know, see 20th century and 21st century song tradition as kind of one thing. And that sort of enables me to, you know, when we're kind of talking about my music, I think it enables me to sort of go in and out of some of those things a little bit, you know, with a little bit of grace, because I feel like I do sort of have an understanding of how conceptually they are related. It's not just a grab bag of like, let's try this and let's try this and let's try this and let's try this. There are things that connect that music,
right,
that are powerful.
After the break, Matthew talks about founding Spacebomb and dealing with the surprise success of his debut album. Welcome back to Humans of Music and my interview with Matthew E. White. After university, so that was jazz guitar at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. What's the next step between there and starting Spacebomb? I know you had Fight the Big Bull. Was it a jazz band? Jazz band? Is that right?
Yeah, there's basically like 3 steps that are really just 1, 2, 3. It's like coming right out of college. I started basically what was like a promotion. Like I was like a promoter. I didn't even have that word in my vocabulary then, but that's what it was. It was like an event promoter, and I like curated live events around the city and just kind of highlighting. The idea was sort of to highlight different genres and kind of put them in sort of odd context together. So we did a lot of like experimental jazz and string quartet music, or like dance. It's kind of like dance parties with like a string quartet opener. Like it's kind of dumb now. But thinking about, I mean, it's just sort of cheesy. It's all on the nose from a curatorial point of view.
Sure.
But the idea was just to create a community, an audience where they were kind of outside of like rock clubs and sort of outside of like a jazz community, and kind of trying to get some of the kids that were involved in the indie rock world and would go to clubs and would like go out and see stuff to, kind of be aware of that there was cool jazz composition that might be fun to see and just kind of create. I mean, it was just creating an audience. It was creating a local audience for a wide variety of experimental music. And we had Ken Vandermark, who's a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient. Like he came through a bunch of times. Like like the idea was like an importing, exporting. That's what I always used to say was like, and that was the importing part of it.
Right. Was
like getting other people from Chicago or from New York or from LA, like on tour to like stop through Richmond and be a part of that scene. And mainly, again, I'm just talking about experimental music. So not people who had like big audiences or stuff like that. But like if we could get 200 or 300 people out to see like to see Ken Vandermark play, like that was pretty good in Richmond, and he could get paid. And it was just a cool vibe, man. And so I did that coming right out of school. I mean, I started that in school when I was a senior. And then once I sort of had the local audience, I mean, it seems also planned, but it wasn't quite this planned, but it is pretty funny. So once I had that audience where I knew that as a promoter, I could get like 200 or 300 people at a show, that's why I started a band, and that was Fight the Big Bull. And again, it's like, sort of there's a commercial aspect, at least a sliver of it, to what my instincts. It's like, once I had that audience, I started a band, and it was like, okay, I knew that I could write. And basically I just booked a show, booked all the guys, and then wrote an hour's worth of music. We rehearsed it and played it. It's really fun. And then right after that, I got like a bi-weekly or every other week, different terms for that in different parts of the world, but every other week gig where we played, and that we did that for years, 5, 6 years. I was just playing 2 times a month. And I would write arrangements for the band, and we would just read them on the bandstand. And like, it was all instrumental, free, sort of like free jazz, but fun. Like for like Halloween, we covered Thriller. For one Halloween, we did all of Weezer's Blue album. It was like dumb shit like that. Actually, there's a version of that on YouTube that's like really, really old and funny. But like packed, like it was cool because it was like these weird arrangements of like Weezer's Blue album. And there'd be like a line, like a half mile down the street to come see that stuff. But actually way bigger audiences than anything Matthew E. White gets here now, which is really funny. But it's just like, we were like 25 years old. It was like in the middle of the scene there. And then from that, I started to ask to do like arrangements for people, like singers, songwriters. And I wasn't really involved in any kind of like vocal music, anything that you would think of as like indie music or pop music or rock music community, like nothing. It's like pure experimental jazz world. And Fight the Big Bull was like on the cover of some jazz record. I mean, we like had we signed to this label called Clean Feet in Portugal, which is a pretty good reputation. And then people started asking me to do arrangements for them, where I would like write arrangements for Fight the Big Bull to play behind them. And that kind of started opening my eyes to like, okay, like that's cool. I like doing that. But when people ask me to do that, I'm kind of like obligated sort of financially, like to use the guys in the band. Because if they're asking Fight the Big Bull to do it, like I'm writing, that means that it's like 8 guys and I have to use them. I can't use less than 8 or really more than 8. It was like that. And I was like, well, that's cool. But, you know, at that time I was starting to listen to a lot of like, there's like that Rotary Connection album that was like really big deal for me. I don't know if you know that is this producer, Charles Stepney, producer arranger, is like just really conceptual, big, like late 60s, like Sgt. Pepper style, but like soul and really expansive and really heady kind of arrangements. And I was like, man, it'd be cool to, you know, Fight the Big Bull does what it does, but like if I sort of, just kind of connecting the dots with the community and being like, well, there's a bigger community here than just these 8 guys. And like people could come to me, or I could even ask people to come and I could produce it and write arrangements and then just put that under basically one umbrella and call it a Spacebomb and saw definitely a handful of opportunities where that could make money and just sort of be mutually beneficial to each of the wings of the company, for lack of a better word. And just kind of like kicked that idea around for a while. And then, you know, long story short, started the company and wanted to make a record and had a lot of ideas about how I wanted to do it. And it turned out to be, you know, a little bit difficult to get someone to hand me the keys in the way that I sort of like intended. And, you know, just kind of like, I don't know, I was, I guess, just naive, egotistically naive. So thought like, oh, you know, like someone will just want me to produce their record and, you know, like put out their record and like oversee the art for their record. You know, it's like, sure, someone will want this, but no one did. And so I was like, well, I'll just do it. I'll just do it myself. And I wrote the songs for Beginner. It was the first 7 songs I wrote. I only wrote 7 because I was just kind of like wanted to get it done, sort of. Not that I didn't work hard on it, but it was very practical. It was like, I need to make something for this label because I want to sort of get this idea off the ground as a producer. And I need to show people what we can do and just kind of go check the, you know, just kind of go through the process because I knew that it could be pretty cool. I thought it could be pretty cool and pretty unique. I mean, really at the time, it's funny to look back on it. It's like people weren't really doing it. I mean, even like Daptone, they weren't really doing it to the scale that Spacebomb did it. It was like the sort of local, highly regional local version of like scaling up the Wrecking Crew, like in a way, like that was the idea and just kind of made Beginner. And that was that. I mean, that's why we're talking now.
Yeah. But then Beginner becomes, I think I've seen a quote from you where you said you expected a couple hundred people to buy it or your expectations were quite low. But then you spend the next 12 to 18 months touring the world off the back of it, getting critical notices, playing the Sydney Opera House, playing big festivals around the world. How long did it take you to get used to that lifestyle, of being on the road?
Well, I mean, the traveling part wasn't that big a deal. That was fun. I mean, that was just, you know, that was just being with my friends and playing shows. But I don't know. I mean, that's like, that's the crux of most of my interpersonal conflict to this day is what happened, you know, like with that. Not that it's funny because anytime I talk about Beginner, it's like I'm a pretty confident, you know, trending, egotistical guy. I thought that it was good. It wasn't that I didn't think it was really good. I just didn't think people would care. So like, it's like there's a difference there that I think is important for people that are trying to understand it to understand. Like it wasn't that we didn't work hard. We worked our ass off on it and we all thought that it was pretty fucking sick. But I just didn't think that as a face, I mean, I like talking to you and I like doing stuff like this. I like playing shows, but I just had so little relationship with the music industry. Like, I mean, no relationship. Like when I got asked to play Glastonbury, my manager called me and was like, oh, you got asked to play Glastonbury in the 6th slot or whatever. I had no fucking clue what Glastonbury was. I was like, really? I don't know. Is that cool or is that not cool? I don't know. I didn't know anything about anything. It's impossible to communicate how little I knew about the actual music industry part of it. So that part, I was just like, didn't know about and didn't really care so much to know about. I mean, I thought of Spacebomb as existing as sort of a satellite to the industry, kind of a culty, you know, kind of one-stop shop, like we do what we do, vertically integrated. You come here for this and then you leave, and I don't have to, you know, like I was telling my wife the other day, because my friend is going to LA to be a screenwriter, or like going to school to be a screenwriter. It's like crazy. He's like, it's like so intimidating to me that he's going to do that. And I was telling her, I was like, you know, I went to extravagant measures to keep myself away from the pressures or the like reality of having to integrate with the actual music industry. I created a vertically integrated ecosystem that would, in my mind, would never have to interact with any of that shit. It would just be like, we do what we do. You come pay and you leave, and we'll just keep doing that. And that was kind of like the idea. So when it, you know, and that's just not realistic. And, you know, I mean, a lot of that is ignorant. I'm not saying that because it was correct. I'm just saying that because that helps illuminate some of the like ignorance that was at play when Beginner came out. And when that became just, you know, like just untenable and just like not realistic at all, you know, it's like, okay. And it's like all of a sudden I'm playing these festivals. I have no idea who the other bands are. I have no idea what the festivals are. I don't know what's important and what's not important. I had never, you know, it was just kind of weird. And it still is a little bit weird, to be perfectly honest, because I don't engage. Like I was saying earlier, I don't really engage. It's not that I don't have peers that I respect, but I don't really like, my scene is like my friends in Richmond and like the musicians I love in Richmond. And it's still a little bit of an island, and I kind of like prefer it like that. All that to say is like, it's still like kind of sometimes dealing with when it's less of an island. Right. Like I mean, I like the people. I like talking to nice people. And I love when people like the music. I mean, I'm really appreciative of that. And my life has changed, you know, like I was, when Beginner came out, I was teaching 50 kids a week how to play guitar. And now I do shit like this. And that is like way, way, way better. And so like, you know, like I'm very appreciative of that. I just didn't necessarily expect it to happen. And I'm really appreciative of the label of Domino. You know, I mean, you haven't gotten to this part of the story, but Spacebomb, you know, we licensed Beginner to Domino, and Domino has been incredible. Yeah. Incredibly supportive. And I, as someone who, you know, obviously that more than dabbles in record labels at this point, like the Domino is as good as it gets, you know, and their support is unwavering and has been, you know, they deserve a lot of credit for everything that I do, really.
Sure. It's so interesting what you're saying about your attitude, and it explains a lot behind the idea of Spacebomb, that idea of it almost just existing in its own little world. So Spacebomb, if I understand correctly, it's a record label. It's a recording studio with a band, I suppose, as you mentioned the Wrecking Crew before, so it comes with its own band. It looks after publishing, management. Like it's, as you mentioned, it's that vertical kind of system, I suppose. But you must have there must have been a huge learning curve, because if you weren't that concerned with the industry to then put together this thing like Spacebomb, you must have, what were some of the big lessons that you had to learn to pull that off?
Oh, God. Well, I don't have that much time. Yeah, I mean, one of the lessons was, well, I was telling you about Patchwork Collective. One thing I did at Patchwork Collective, that was like the promoting organization I started out of college, was like, I basically did everything. It was me and a couple other guys, but like the art and the business and the dealing with artists and the music. I just did everything. And so Spacebomb was designed very much with space to fill for other people. So part of it, you know, I founded it, but I mean, there was like a group of 8 people, 8 friends who filled various spots on the Spacebomb bus. And from the very beginning, I knew that there were certain things that I wasn't good at and didn't want to do. So, you know, I mean, I would say that was sort of step one, was understanding that I didn't want to do everything. And basically, like, I was always going to be like head of creative shit. And there was going to be somebody who was the CEO, that I wasn't going to be the CEO of Spacebomb. I knew that I thought that it was a good idea. And that if the idea was good enough, that it would create an economy where someone could sit in the seat as CEO and run a company that not that I'm like I don't have the worst business mind in the world, but I just don't want to be a CEO like in that way. But I knew that we were going to need one. And there's just other seats on that bus, like, you know, with the management stuff and with publishing. And you know, I kind of had a loose idea that was, you know, kind of what was supposed to happen. But just as things got real, it was, I mean, basically when there began to be money, like that, you know, they answered all your questions is money, basically. Like, that's the truth, you know. It's like that is a great truth teller for how things work and how people are related to certain situations. And, you know, so when that started to happen, there was a little bit of money kicking around. Then it was just a lot of conversations. That started to separate it out. Like, who's going to be doing what? You know, who's going to be doing what? What are we doing here? Like, and that was a big domino chain that lasted from Beginner to Natalie's record to Bedouin's record to then we sold part of the company to Glassnote and Daniel Glass. And that's like now. I mean, that's still a learning curve of like, okay, we have this much money. What are we going to do with it? This much money, this much money, this much money, this much money. And yeah, I mean, huge learning curves in terms of like some of the nitty gritty with how the business works and some conceptual stuff. And we had stuff work for a long time. And then we kind of had a season where stuff actually wasn't working. And we were like, which is normal for record labels, but we had never really experienced in that. And that was, you know, that was different. You know, I had to drop people from the label, which was like never my intention really. And that was not great. I don't love that. Although it just is what it is, you know? And I don't mean that to make light of anyone's personal circumstance that we interface with in a way that didn't end like we wanted it. It's just the business is a fucked up, brutal, no mercy business, you know, and that cuts both ways all the time. And we try to be, you know, respectful and obviously like to handle things the right way, but it's just hard. It's a really hard business. And there's been times where we were lucky, you know, we had our first 3 records basically were like, none of them were like smash hits. I mean, that would be nice. I would have preferred that, but we don't have a record that just like pays our bills every month, but we have, you know, Beginner and Natalie's first record and Bedouin's first record were all like solid indie successes that helped us establish a base for doing stuff. And I don't know, it's definitely complicated. I mean, it's super complicated.
Sure.
No way around that.
Yeah, that's Natalie Press's you're referring to.
Yeah.
So all that said, are you still able to operate a little bit outside the industry? Have you still been able to retain a little bit of autonomy and not be too pulled into that? Yeah.
I mean, Spacebomb has sort of pivoted significantly more towards a traditional label model where we're signing artists and we may or may not interface with their music in the same way, like that we did with Natalie's record, or records like that. We're kind of more in the early part of the label. And because of that, I'm sort of, you know, I'm spiritually involved with Spacebomb, but on a day-to-day, like, I mean, the office is like, whatever, 200 yards from my house. And I'm friendly and have a great relationship with the company, and I'm employed by the company a little bit, but I'm not really too involved with the day-to-day. It's like a normal record label that signs artists, and I love all the artists that we have on the roster, and have a management roster that I have like nothing to do with, but it's very successful. And, you know, it's a business that runs, it has an office and shit. Like, I don't really, it's really not a part, and I don't mean this to belittle my relationship with Spacebomb or to cause, you know, for people to think that there's friction there, because there's not. I'm in an interpersonal way. It's like, it's just it's a business, and I'm proud of the fact that it works and it runs. But I think the sort of umbrella of stuff that's like kind of my world and sort of my babies, and like the stuff that I'm real like hands-on with, that stuff I think is increasingly falling more under the Matthew E. White world. It's just, again, I think it just makes a little more sense, and it's starting to make more sense like that. Mm-hmm. And Spacebomb is a exciting young record label that releases exciting young artists, but in the way that it started 10 years ago when Beginner came out. It's not quite like that.
Right.
But there's a lot of good reasons why it's not like that, because investing that much money in vertical integration is good, except when it goes bad, and then there's no way to catch or fall. It's kind of all goes bad.
Yeah.
And that's one of the difficulties of releasing records, that you're A&Ring and producing and engineering and doing the artwork for and curating basically every aspect of it. It's tough. It's tough to make that like tough to make it work long term.
Yeah, okay. But it was your vision initially, and it's just yeah, cool. Just last couple of things, Matthew. I've seen in certain stories that, interviews with you, and journalists have sort of drawn this parallel between the building of the communities that your parents did with their missionary work, and then your building of communities such as around the Richmond music scene. Is there a parallel between those two, do you think, or is that just a narrative that gets spun?
One person asked me that question, and I think that it has caused many other people to ask me that question. I remember very specifically when he asked that, and I thought, that's a good question. That's like a question that a writer would kind of come up with to sort of invent narratives that might not be there. It's hard. That question's funny. To me, like on the surface, it kind of projects a little bit more onto the situation than I'm comfortable projecting. But at the same time, the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree. I'm a lot like my dad, and not even necessarily in a spiritual way. I mean, my dad just likes having people around. He's a natural leader. He connects people. He likes energy. He likes doing stuff, and he likes people to be having fun. And there's some similarities definitely to what I do. I really hesitate to like substitute metaphorically like a musical connection for like a spiritual one. I think that's a little bit of a reach, at least for me to be self-aware enough about to really talk with in any detail.
Sure. Very lastly, Jaxsta is all about giving credit where credit is due. Are there people you give credit to for helping you get where you are today?
Oh, yeah. God. List is way too long. I could just keep going for another couple hours. But I think the biggest one that I think, if we're just naming a couple, like there's a guy named Stephen Bernstein who you may or may not be familiar with. He's a trumpet player in New York. And he really took me under his wing. Like, he was the first guy to tell me that my music was any good, which was funny because I was in music school at the time, and none of my like professors or like, peers at the school really like paid attention to anything that I was doing. It wasn't notable at all. I wasn't like a notable member of the jazz community where I was going to school by any stretch of the imagination. But, I was pretty driven, and I got in touch with Stephen, just kind of bulldoggishly got in touch with him, and managed to meet up with him and played some music that I'd recorded. And he was just so positive about it and really nurtured me a lot as a young creative and arranger. I mean, I still have like basically the notebook the first time I met him, and he was like, he's just like, we did like a lesson that was supposed to be this. I told him I was going to be in New York, but I really wasn't. I was like, I'm going to be in New York on this day. Can you do a lesson? He's like, sure, come by the house. And I drove like 7 hours to his house. I woke up at like 4 o'clock in the morning and drove to his house for like a 11 o'clock lesson, because I told him I was going to be in town, but I just made it up so he wouldn't think that I was crazy. and I ended up spending like all day there. It was really funny because he thought I was in town, but I had to drive back. So it was like a hellish drive back, because I spent like 11 o'clock at night, and then I drove like 11 to 6 in the morning back. But like it was supposed to be like an hour lesson. It ended up being like 6 or 7 hours, maybe dinner. And he just like pulled records off the shelf, played records all day. And God, that is definitely the most important day of my entire musical life by far. And the records, just like all the stuff, like a bunch of New Orleans records, like Alan Toussaint's relationship with the band, and the band's relationship with like 70s rock, and then Miles Davis' relationship with Sly Stone, and just when I talk about like understanding feeling like I understand Louis Armstrong to whatever is now like, that's Steven. I mean, Steven he's a fucking god of that shit. And like, you know, he just deserves everything that I do is like sort of like, was like shifted, you know. He really just nurtured like an individual voice that he heard and no one else had heard it and no one else had said anything about it. No one else had really supported that. And he was the first one that was like, no, like you have something here. And I was like pretty insecure. Like in jazz school, it's like super fucking like ego town, you know, and I wasn't special in my eyes there to anyone. I mean, I wasn't, but Steven really identified something and that really pushed me. And he connected a lot of the dots. I mean, he had some really practical advice. I remember he told me very early on, he was like, never release a record without hiring a publicist, which is basically like, that's a little bit different now because publicists don't work in the same way, but the concept is the same. He was like, don't ever release a record into the void. Like it's pointless. Yeah. And I think, and then that first record that he heard the demos of and like I released the first Fight the Big Bull record, I like saved up all my money, paid $1,000 to hire a publicist, and that publicist got that record on NPR's Fresh Air, which is like one of the biggest radio shows in the United States. And that got me connected with this guy who wanted to do arrangements, and that ended up me doing arrangements for Justin Vernon. And that was it. Yeah. You know, it's like really bam, 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 bam. It was all because if I had just released that record to like in a local way, none of that would have happened probably. And so it's funny because Steven, like I look at Steven now and he's not like the most, I mean, he's really with it for like where he is in like his genre and stuff. But, you know, it's just interesting how it changes. Like my business experience right now is like from what I've had the past 10 years shoots me well beyond Steven's experience in the record industry. I mean, he has a way, way, way more experience in terms of a session musician and that kind of stuff. But it's just interesting how it changes, you know, like your experience level. I mean, he was dealing with me at like a time I didn't know shit about anything. And he just gave me so much, so much. That's great. So yeah, big shout out to him. Awesome. Matthew, thank you so much for your time. Yeah. It's been really great to talk to you. Absolutely. Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much. And that's it for another episode of Humans of Music. A big thanks to Matthew for his time and thank you for listening. And just a reminder, Matthew's new album, K-Bay, is out now. If you have any feedback on the show or suggestions on who you'd like me to interview, or even if you just want to say hello, please drop me a line at humansofmusic@jaxsta.com. That's humansofmusic, one word, at Jaxsta, JAXSTA.com. This episode was mixed by Lachlan Mitchell from Parliament Studios in Annandale, and the incidental music and theme song were written and performed by Sam Lockwood. Please remember to subscribe to the Humans of Music podcast so you never miss an episode, or even better, share it amongst your friends and rate and review it. And remember, next time you need to know who wrote a song, who produced a song, who engineered it, who played on it, who sang on it, who did anything on it, head to Jaxsta.com for all your official music credit information. Until the next episode of Humans of Music, I'm Rod Yates. Thanks for listening.